yet another episode of Freebird. And today we are quite pleased to have Reema Ahmad with us. Reema is joining us from the city of Agra in India. And you guys know it's one of my favorites. Reema, let's share a little bit about Reema first. Reema is the co-founder of Candidly, an initiative that talks about gender, sexuality, abuse, and how these manifest in culture through media. And she started Candidly as a joint venture with her longtime friend, Amita Malhotra, who also launched India's first gender-neutral clothing line for kids called EqualiTee. What a fantastic idea. Reema is a trained comprehensive sexuality educator, a writer, an intimacy and relationships and sexuality coach. She's been a 2-time TEDx speaker, and please do go out there and check out her TED Talks. It's hilarious, and it has a lot of good information too. And Reema began her journey actually in 2014 as a researcher and trainer on child abuse awareness and prevention for kids and adults. And I personally think that's a really hard thing to do. So kudos to you there. She's also worked with the Council to Secure Justice in the area of restorative justice and has counseled families that have been dealing with child sexual abuse and survivors therein. And what's also very interesting is she is a poet. And her first book on discussing taboo subjects with children is actually in the works with Penguin India. So all around fantastic, brave, courageous, and quite vivacious. Thanks, Reema, for being on Freebird.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on Freebird. I'm so excited. This is going to be my first podcast.
Yes, and it's going to be fantastic.
Yes.
So, Reema, I mean, although you are quite the expert at so many things and you've got years of experience in handling relationship issues, today we're not here to actually talk about women. We're here to talk about men. Imagine 2 women talking about men.
How much sexier can it be?
Exactly. So I wanted to start by saying that, the way a lot of societies are structured today, we have these very strongly defined gender roles and gender identities. And, you just have to look at the social lexicon and you'll have things like boys will be boys, girls should wear pink, girls should take care of or mothers are the primary caregivers. And if you go to Hindi movies, there's Mard ka bachcha bano and all of that, right? So where does all of this actually come from? I mean, what is the genesis? Why does it exist in the first place? Because it sounds so bizarre that we have such defined things. And frankly, as a therapist, I'm sure you've seen it. What challenges does this bring to society?
So if you were to go back in time like thousands and thousands of years, so if you go back in time before we set up ourselves as agricultural societies where a certain piece of land belonged to a family and then more specifically to the man of the family. Before that, human beings were majorly hunter-gatherers. And, when you had a hunting and gathering societies, everything was shared, So the work was shared where everybody would go out and hunt and gather. And the work within, wherever people chose to be together in the community was shared. Relationships were shared. In almost all hunting gathering societies, you do not find any clear evidence of monogamy, of there being any idea of one man being with one woman. So there's this idea of shared space, shared community. People, could be sexually involved with whoever they wanted to be. And the community brought up the children as their own. So there you find there's this absolute absence of any defined kind of family structure. That comes in with agricultural societies where people start to call a piece of land their own. And when you have a piece of land, you want to protect it. And how do you protect it? By naming it yours. And then how else do you protect it? By making sure it is passed on to your children. Yeah. And how do you make sure that happens? That happens when you are with one woman who produces your progeny, and it is passed on from father to son to son. So that is the basic sort of connection. And how all of this translates into defined masculine and feminine roles is, again, a lot of it has to do with ownership of property. So when you own property and you own a piece of land and you own a family, you are quote unquote the master. And to be the master, you need to build a certain kind of characteristic. And it is with the advent of structured religion that those characteristics become more and more defined, that the man is the head of the family, that the woman needs to obey, that the children need to obey, and that the man owns property and the woman is, and the whole Christian and narrative of the woman being formed out of the rib of the man for the use and pleasure of the man. So you see how all of this is all working together across time and culture around the same time everywhere in the world. And therefore, this strong narrative of man and woman emerges. And where the woman is supposed to be gentle and, nurturing and all of that, because that is required now, because you have a family that is cooped up in one space. So you need somebody in the house. And how do you get that? You glorify that kind of role of a woman, bring her up to you're the mother, you're the nurturer, you're the, feminine, this, that, and the other. And to, solidify the image of the man as an owner, you build up his image, the aggressor, the dominant person, the strong person, and the master of it all and everything. And as time passes, these characteristics, they grow inwards and they start reflecting in culture and through culture. So it is an exchange that is happening at the personal level and at the social cultural level. And then it magnifies because it reaches a religious political level. So you have the structure from the bottom up and upwards down. And all through, societies which have moved away from pre-agriculture, narratives, which had a lot to do with stability, with the balance of the feminine and the masculine energy, and that being reflected in almost all ancient pre-agriculture scripture or lore, which is why a lot of societies which still sort of have those traditions will not have very, very strongly defined masculine and feminine roles. And to answer the second part of your question of why it is problematic is that inherently, I believe, and research also proves that men and women are men and women only, because they're born with certain body parts. The whole idea of what it is to be a man does not have anything that is very starkly different from what it is to be a woman in terms of how we're attuned to behave naturally, which was how we were before agricultural societies. So it's pretty much the same, except for certain emotional surges in women, which is again linked to their cycles and all of that. But other than that, we were all created as emotional beings and also as rational beings. It is only the very, very cultured perspective that defines man as a rational being and a woman as an emotional being. And what that has done to both men and women is that it has disabled them, completely cut them off, cut women off from their rational sort of sides, intellectual sides, because when generation after generation you're made to believe that you don't have something, you begin believing it. When you're not allowed.
I want to quote to you something really funny that happened, which kind of made me think about this for the first time. So we were holidaying in Norway, and we were at airport security. And, as you would have in our countries, most Southeast Asian, Middle Eastern countries, the people who were picking the bags off the conveyor belts are mostly men. And here we were waiting for our luggage and all of that. And then I suddenly see these really tall, very blonde, very female women coming and doing all these little masculine tasks. And for me, for a second, it was like, whoa, you're strong. And I thought it's just an aberration, it's just a fluke. Maybe this woman was really strong. And then as we traveled more and more in the Scandinavian countries, we realized that their society, it's so egalitarian, more egalitarian and less patriarchal than our societies. And there, the narrative, the view of how roles are, and the kind of mindset that, oh, men are stronger than women, physically or otherwise, they would get offended. Like if you would open the door for a woman, she'd be like, hello, I can do it for myself. So, for me, that was the first time I actually chanced upon something like this and thought, is it possible that we've got it all wrong?
No, we have got it all wrong, really. Because again, those cultures that you're talking about, Scandinavia, Norway, they're still very much in touch with pre-agriculture narratives of how everybody was doing everything and there was nothing wrong with that. Even if you go back in time to our own culture, and you go back to the villages, you'll see that women do just as much or even more labor than men. This is a very post-church and a very westernized sort of, by Western I mean a very British concept of femininity that wherever they went, which was wherever the areas which were colonized, have imbibed really, really strongly. Because if you look at our own culture, if you look at places like Kerala or like northeastern states or even the Himachali states, women do just as much work as men.
Yeah.
And there is no, and women and men you'll find are often the ones who are seen, quote unquote, whiling away time or doing this. The women who are strong is the women who go out and earn money. It's the women who have inheritance in their names. So it's very interesting how the Christian, the values of the Roman Church, the Orthodox Church created this kind of divide between how men are supposed to be and how women are supposed to be. And if you live that life for long enough, for example, for women like us who've been cut off from working outside of our homes because we were brought up inside the house, of course, over generations, you lose that physical ability to withstand harsh conditions, to withstand hard labor. And then you feel like, oh, I can't do this because you know what, women can't do this. It's not like that. Everywhere you go, and even if you go to New Zealand, I went to New Zealand in 2018, and it is populated by people who came in later. But because they were so closely in touch with the Maori culture, and because the land had to be built up, and there were very few resources, so you see these tall, strapping, very hardy women doing everything.
It's so
because that's how their culture and their society was built up. So everybody does everything. If you go to a farm, you'll find women managing farms, you'll find women riding horses, you'll find women doing everything because they had really no other option. That's how it was. And similarly, if you go to pre-colonized America, everybody was doing everything. So there may have been some roles in terms of who went out to battle, but everybody was trained to do everything. And everybody learned.
Yeah, and Reema, it's so interesting because a lot of pop culture books, also kind of created even bigger divides later on. If you're looking at the 90s, and in the promo, I posted this book with aliens walking around. Basically, it's called "Men Are from Mars." And I wanted to theme this entire conversation we're having that men are not from Mars. We're pretty much on the same planet. And I really wanted you to maybe even touch upon and speak to what challenges does this, firstly, gender divide cause in society. We'll come a little more into men more specifically, but what is that gender divide doing today? Because we are not breaking bricks and sowing potatoes for sure, most of us.
What that gender divide is continued to do is that, when that whole system becomes a part of your being through generational, just like there's generational trauma, there's also generational learning. So over generations, we've learned to be a certain way, which is women have learned to be quieter, have learned to limit themselves in terms of what they want to do because they've seen and felt for centuries that this is allowed to us. And similarly, men have been also pushed outside of the house, whether they wanted to or not, was a different thing. Okay? Yeah. And they've been pushed outside of the house that you go, you earn the money and you do this, etc. So the hunting is still going on, but it is only for men. For the hunting space is now the office space where they go out and get to be all aggressive and all macho and everything, because this is my territory and this is what I do.
Exactly.
And because somewhere along the middle, women were so entrenched in the household. Now that they're trying to get back to what they think that they can do, which in pre-agricultural societies everybody was doing everything. Now there's so less space for them. And for them to be able to fit into a man's sort of quote unquote man's world, they have to let go of a lot of what comes innately to them. Wow. Because they need to fit in, because that kind of femininity is not natural in that space.
Oh yeah.
Similarly, in the house space, in the family space, that kind of masculinity or macho-ness or involvement of men in raising and rearing children is not natural. What we think is natural and unnatural is actually constructed over generations. So it's not like men can't, or that men don't have the ability to. It's just that they've been programmed not to pay attention to the emotional nurturing side, because that has been labeled a certain way. Now, if you look at it largely, what it does is it creates this clear demarcation of spaces where men are welcome in certain spaces and women are welcome in certain spaces. What that does at individual levels is that we find it very, very difficult to pay attention to enhance, or to involve ourselves in many things at the same time, which is what human beings are possible. They can possibly do. They are, we are wired through the way our bodies and minds are formed to be able to be multi-learners and multitaskers and learn a variety of skills over an extended period of time. But because of this divide, certain skills are now limited to women's experiences and other skills are limited to men's experiences. And what that also does is it brings out changes in behavior which are not necessarily healthy. So, for example, what aggression does to men. Why do men have this underlying sense of aggression and not being able to, sort of find more peaceful ways to address issues? Is that over generations, they've been taught to believe that if you are gentle and if you have a nuanced approach and if you're soft, you're not man enough. Therefore, you take on this aggressive tone when you need to get anything done. And that works in the outside world to some extent. It doesn't work in relationships, because what that does is, one, the emotional vulnerability that is at the core of every human being, irrespective of their sex, is denied to them. And when they don't get that space and that voice to be emotionally vulnerable, to say that I'm feeling sorrow, or I'm sad, or I'm feeling depressed, it sort of gets really, 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 really compacted and comes out as aggression and anger.
Wow.
So I really feel like there's a need for that space to be created for men where they can reclaim their vulnerability without necessarily, without having to separate it from being masculine. Vulnerability and masculine. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, sorry.
Let's talk a little bit more, maybe like pull that thread a little bit more, Reema. So I love that you're talking about, you're a little Brené Brown, the way you're talking about vulnerability and masculinity. You go, girl. But, let's talk a little bit about the impacts of what this kind of gender divide has created on men and their roles in society. So, you and I, women of the 21st century, we have seen, and we are currently even seeing, the advent of female empowerment. I mean, talk about the Me Too movements, what's happened with Harry Weinstein, what's happening with us trying to shatter glass ceilings at the workplace, still in progress, but not there. So there's this huge activism, right, which is there, and women are really at the forefront of all of it. And, as an empowered woman myself, I would love to see myself as that. But my question is this: are men being neglected? What is the to the male narrative? Because there isn't a conversation. I mean, I'm in a relationship, I'm married, and I don't really hear from Neil what the male narrative or what his movement is, right? And more importantly, and what the scary question I have for you is, are we raising healthy, functional men in society? I mean,
We're not. We're
oh,
really not. Because if we were, then we'd be paying more attention to what is the messaging that we're passing on to our boys and men.
wow.
So I wouldn't say that men are being neglected, but I would say that men are not being included enough in the narrative. And why that has happened also has a logical explanation, because if you subdue and neglect a larger part of the population over centuries, which has been women, for them to be able to get like an equal space, there has to be that kind of strong movement which started with the suffragette movement, and everything in it was about getting the right to vote and owning land and the right to work outside the house. But what that has also done to both men and women is that we've become very abrasive. You
Yeah.
know, we've become so abrasive because women have also internalized that in order to be out in the world, I need to be a certain way, and have been sort of subconsciously forced to shed a lot of their femininity, which has made them very aggressive. And like people would say it's pushy, but I think it's a factor of having to survive in a world which was not ready to welcome them
It's a learned
the way they
behavior.
were. It's like that if you dress in a pantsuit, you're more welcome in a board meeting than if you want to dress in a sari and want to wear files, because then you're really not. And we've heard stories about that from
Oh, yeah.
women who work in the IT sector, who work in the business sector all the time, or how they look down on if they look desi. Now, similarly with men, I think to be able to make room for women who were coming out in droves and droves and droves. I mean, we've enabled women to make the leap from the house to the outside world. But have we enabled men to be able to accept and be receptive and be aware about the leap that's happening with women? So what has happened is men used to owning that space and owning that the office space or the workspace or the business space, suddenly realizing that, okay, so women can be here too. And without a very conscious addressing of the divide and telling them that you need to be more open or more embracing or more accepting of this change, there is huge resistance because they are not prepared for the kind of leap women are making. And as more and more,
that is so brilliant.
yeah, and
I just say amazing. Yeah. Go on.
Okay, and as more and more women come out working into offices, men are threatened because they are not prepared. And when they're threatened, what they do? They push down even more strongly. They become more aggressive. They become abusive. And what is the one way that a man can be abusive towards a woman? Most of it is sexually, because that is what is ingrained in us through generations. That to overpower a woman, you overpower her sexually. Therefore, sexual harassment, sexual abuse in the offices, because they're just not ready. They're like, oh my God, what's happening? So it's also about this feeling of terror that this is my space and my territory which is now being taken away, and I am not ready for this. So women were being prepared through the 60s and the 70s to go out, but were boys and men being prepared through the 60s and the 70s and the 80s to be ready for this kind of woman? So that is where the divide is. That is where the neglect is, that men and boys were not really prepared to live side by side and to live, cohesively and equally with women who were now different. And for men, it was very sudden. Oh my God, what's happened?
Yeah.
And you see that reflected in pop culture. You see that reflected in, there's this song by Honey Singh, कि पहले तो मुझसे लेती थी सारी चीजें, पहले मुझसे कहती थी, अब जाके खुद खरीद लेती है. And men not prepared for a woman like that. She doesn't need anything from me now. Therefore, to get her attention, what do? I use power.
There's this.
Where do you see?
This thing just occurred to me as you were speaking, because I think it's such a unique way that you've put it. When women are at the workplace, and having spent most of my working life in big corporates, you would always say that, why is this happening? And all, And there's such a big narrative that, we as women are victims, and, look at all the stuff that we have to deal with, and men hitting on us and all of that. I never thought to realize that we are actually victims of victims. Those boys themselves, they don't even realize it. They don't even know why they're behaving probably in the way they are, because no one's actually talked about what you just said, the fact that their claimed spaces are now becoming shared spaces, and they just don't know how to behave.
Yeah, and also the fact that any change to be sustainable and for any change to be warm, there needs to be balance on both sides. And I think that is what the feminist movement sort of really missed out on when it began. And when you read about the early feminists, they were not anti-men. They were pro-women, but the anti-men sort of narrative comes in much, much later, that everything that men were suddenly became distasteful, and which is what it further created the divide between men and women. That men were became obstinate about, no, this is the way I am and this is the way I'm going to be, and and becoming more abrasive and more aggressive and all of that, which of course didn't work well for them, right? Because that's the image that they're projecting more and more in media or in workspaces. So of course they'll lose out on a lot of sympathy or empathy, and then who's going to care what they feel? So over decades, what has happened is that people, women really don't care about men feel, because they've been feeling unheard for so long that they're like, we really don't care. You're getting what you deserve. But I feel like now, if we want to move ahead, and if you want to really create a sort of balance and inclusion in society, there needs to be that open, welcoming space where men are allowed, and they can also talk about what they feel all of this change has done to them. Because what I hear, and this is where, I wouldn't be able to say this 5 years ago, because I had pretty much the same perspective, that all men are like that and blah, blah, blah. They're all, it's only when you are on the other side of the table as maybe a therapist or a coach, and you meet men who are breaking down. And when I say breakdown, I don't mean a breakdown that is evident as it is in women. I mean, outwardly, you'll see them functioning very well. They're earning and they're doing everything that needs to be done. But when it comes to things like relationships or commitment, you see them terribly afraid. Because for them, that means opening up this vulnerable space, which they're just not prepared to open, because they don't know how to deal with hurt and pain the same way women do. Because they're just not, they're so afraid of breaking down that they have stopped opening up. And which also reflects again in the popular dating scene. What is the one complaint that most women have? No men are willing to commit. They all want sex, and they just all want casual sex. And why is that? And if you put your head to it, you'd know that is why, because men are really afraid of emotion, because they've been denied it for so long that they have no understanding of how to deal with it, how to talk about it, how to talk about if they're uncomfortable or sad or depressed, because that is also again not taken seriously. And then again they get labeled that, why are you crying? Are you crying like a girl? What's your problem? You're crying over a heartbreak? You're crying over an ex? Really? And men make fun of men because they're also products of that same culture. Just the same way, women make fun of women when they sort of, that lack of access to vulnerability is happening in both spaces.
I think I narrated this incident to you, which I'd love to share with everyone here, because sometimes, we can talk about something and we don't identify it. We're not open to seeing it around when it happens around us. So, a year ago when I moved to this city that I now live in, I had joined a meditation group. And, as is normal in most yoga classes, most meditation groups, I would find women, and they're women circles, and everyone's there for each other, and it's sort of like sisterhood. But I remember at the time, we were like, okay, let's open the circle to men. And you will not believe it, Reema, we had to drag them to kind of come into this space. That was number one. And maybe 2 or 3 exceptionally emotionally aware men would come, mostly because they were threatened by their wives. And, and then while they were there, and they would see like us women being so raw and so open, and we would be like, yes, this happened, and it made me feel very, very, unheard. They would be looking at us like, what is this language? I mean, they did not.
Language that you're talking into.
Yeah, they
Yeah.
didn't have the lexicon. They didn't have the language, the vocabulary to even understand. And it hit me like a ton of bricks. I was like, oh my Lord. I mean, how can we ever imagine having sustainable, healthy relationships? Forget married life and all of that. I mean, that's a huge other topic. But even the beginnings of it, if men aren't even able to vocalize what it is
How
that
they feel.
how they feel. So
And how that not feeling, sorry.
yeah, please go ahead.
So, and how that not feeling manifests is that they're so busy exploring relationships on the surface. You'll find like only 1 in 10 men who's willing to deep dive and talk about how he really feels about a woman, because that is threatening. Because that's like, again, putting your heart out on a platter, which a woman can squish and walk away with. And then what do? Because we, over the years, developed the resilience to bounce back, but they haven't. So you see more and more men stuck in a one relationship in the past that happened some 8-9 years ago, and not willing to give another woman a really, a really authentic chance at making something work, because they're so afraid. They don't even want to
You're
go there.
drawing the sketch of a lot of our old boyfriends. You know what I mean?
Yeah. A lot of my old boyfriends, I mean, oh my God. Like the last one, was really interesting guy that I met and so engaging. And I was like, yes, I found my person.
Yeah.
But again, this whole, I can't do this emotional stuff. And it really makes me very afraid. And at least he was, mature enough to say afraid, maybe because he was well into his 40s and he found that language. Men in their 20s, they don't even know how to do that, because they just act out, or they'll block you, or they do something stupid and irrational, which like, wait, what happened? But then I've learned to see that as fear. That there's this woman who's ready and I'm not ready, and how do I tell her that?
So
I will just push her and block her, and I will not talk to her again.
Imagine that.
Yeah.
So tell me, Reema, I mean, do you believe in all the work that you've been doing, especially in the last 5 years, that the time has come for the emotional emancipation of men? And if so, how can we actually create more inclusive conversations? Where does it begin? I mean, or are we even there?
I think it begins in I think it begins in, no, we're not there yet. I don't feel like we're there yet, because we see so much of, gendering happening everywhere, and all that sort of gendering has become more and more pronounced. Childhood and the way things are marketed to children, that divided is even more pronounced now than it was, say, 40 years ago. So there was no concept of pink and blue 100 years ago. That is only, a byproduct of marketing and business manipulation, where you create a need, you create a demand for a certain kind of product because you want those things to be bought more. For example, the Kinder Egg that you see now that comes in pink and blue was only one kind of Kinder Egg before.
It comes in pink and blue? Oh my God! Wow.
With specific, with gender specific toys, the pink egg will have maybe a doll or something pinky, and and the boy egg, the blue egg, will have some. How I know this is I've seen the change in the market with my son growing up. So when he was 1 or 2 years old, there was one kind of Kinder Egg, and now there are 2 kinds of Kinder Egg, and that is a silent messaging that this generation, and we didn't have that kind of messaging, so we were still pretty much okay. But the generations after that, that whole messaging around Barbies and toy trucks, and that messaging goes on in media and cartoons and TV shows and movies. That kind of messaging is everywhere, which is why the divide is deepening and deepening and deepening. You talk to early feminists and they'd say that all it took was maybe like a conversation or 2 or 3 conversations to make men see what we wanted them to see. But now how that conversation became so militant is because there was all of this. It became militant. It literally did. Okay. It's to the extent that men are now afraid of anybody who calls herself a feminist, and when they're afraid, again, they label and they abuse and they use threats and rape threats. I'm not justifying any of it. I know that it is not okay. It's definitely not okay. But for things to change, you have to look at where they began and what are the roots of those things. What are the roots of those behavior? It's just terror, it's fear of the unknown. It's that. I don't know what to do with a woman who's smart and sexy and sassy and can earn her own money. I just don't. Because I'm used to a woman who is dependent on me and who gets, who asks me for stuff, who I can take care of and protect. This woman doesn't need my protection. So what do I do? So I think the change can begin from households where you teach boys, to be equitable, and you foster and sort of, oversee communication flows easily across, gender, and that inclusivity happens in the playroom, in the schoolroom, in the family, where you don't box your children from the very, very beginning, and you keep away this very weird social messaging as much as possible, which is how equality came into being. Because we saw as moms, both me and Amita's daughter is a lot younger than my son, and she was like, I don't know what to get my daughter when I go, because all I see is this bloody pink. And it is a certain kind of pink. It's the fragile and the innocent and the curly and the everything pink. I mean, pink is not even. And I saw that how when my son was under 5, he was okay wearing pink. He didn't really care. But when he went to school and he sees everyone making fun of him because he's wearing a pink T-shirt, I saw that when my son was above, say, 5, 6, 8, the whole obsession with cars and with guns and with wearing a certain kind of color, which has now become black. Like 90% of the time, all he wants to wear is black and look very gunmetal-y. I don't know if that's a term, but like he'd want to look like YouTubers and look like gamers, because that again is all based on merchandise. If you go to the bottom of it, it's about selling us a product. And how do you sell a product? You link it to a certain kind of image. So for men, that image is macho and able to get as many women as possible. Or for women, it's sexy and suave and svelte and be able to get as many men as possible. So it's all about getting into each other's pants, but nobody is teaching us how to get into how to communicate really. How to, outside, because everything has become about getting into each other's pants alone. You look at dating, you look at how people meet, how people engage, how people start relationships, things that would happen, say, after communication, after getting to know each other, and then slowly beginning intimacy. It works the other way around now. So, and which is also, I'm not moralizing, and people are free to do however they want to conduct a relationship. But if you pay attention to the fact that if you're doing something that is so intimate to human nature, which is sex and intimacy, if you're jumping into that without any knowledge of the person, is that really going to be very satisfying to you? And people who come to me, I know it's not. Through my own experience, I know it's not. And they will inevitably tell you that, I had a really strong emotional connect with that person and the sex was beautiful. Because when you have an emotional connect, the sex also has, there's room for communication. There's room for telling somebody, I don't like this, because you're not afraid. Because you're like, you like each other and you say it with this kind of tenderness. Whereas when you meet somebody and jump into bed with them, how do you tell them this is not working? And there are a lot of men and women who can now say things because the narrative is now changed, that you can ask for what you want and all of that. But I see that happening very, very rarely. I mean, I'm 37, and all of my female friends, they have the same problem, that they'll either fake orgasms or fake things in the bedroom, fake things in relationships and marriages, because they don't know how to, without causing an uproar. And on the other spectrum is men who call me and tell me, I don't know how to tell my wife that stuff is not working for me, and I feel like she doesn't want sex anymore and I want sex, and what's going on? So what he's not understanding is that there's something that he needs to do to get her to open up, but she's not telling him either. So,
it's I completely know, because like I have girlfriends too who are like in different stages of their relationship. Some some are married, some are dating, some are single, and almost everywhere the narrative is very, very one-sided, and this for me is always very scary. I mean, I knew Neil way before we got married, and thank God, because we had kind of had so many conversations along the way that somehow even getting, and lucky for me, because I mean, being Indian, you know how it goes with the general male
Yeah.
outlook in society, and I was always this vocal, but he was okay with that. He actually celebrated that. But even in our relationship, there were moments where I would be possibly doing more of a male oriented or male thought of task, and even our families at the time would be like, Snake, take it easy, when's the baby coming, or whatever else, because that's what you're actually supposed to do. I mean, you can be this amazing marketer and whatever else, but unless you have the child, you're not normal. I actually was once told
You're
that
not normal.
you're not normal.
Yeah. And that's another interesting narrative that has been fed to us. Okay, that having a child and creating, that kind of extension of yourself is essential to human nature. And why is that? Again, because the more people there were more, people to till lands, to do labor, to work, and more people to engage in, productive work, which would get in more money in the family.
Yeah.
So, wanting a child, and there have been books written about it, and I was reading, a book about this, the book called The Children We Deserve. Why is it that so many parents end up actively fucking up their kids' lives and minds? Is because they don't really want them. They're not really ready. They have no idea what it takes to bring up a child. They have no idea what it takes to be emotionally responsible, physically responsible for another human being. They're just doing what is ingrained in their system because that is what they feel is right. कि हाँ अब शादी हो गई तो अब बच्चे कर लो. But I don't see any couple, most couples do not pause and ask themselves, are we ready? Are we able emotionally, psychologically,
And
financially?
Is it part of?
Do we even want to? Is it part of our larger life purpose?
Yeah.
And I feel like if that need doesn't come as a calling from within you and out of love, you will not be able to do justice to a child, which is where, I mean, it's crazy how everyone who comes to me, 90% problems are in childhood. They go back to childhood, they go back to the way they were treated, they go back to the pattern they got used to, they go back to the talk that they've used to, and that has now become their self-talk, and it rings in their heads and limits them, or once makes them believe certain things that are not good for them. And it's crazy. In my own life, I've seen the kind of evolution I was able to make was when I was able to successfully shut down the belief systems and the talk and all of the limiting narratives that I was taught growing up in a semi-conventional Muslim household. It's not like my parents meant any harm. They don't know any better. And that was the narrative that they were used to. It's lucky for me that they were able to sort of step out of it because they saw the potential that had, when they decided to send their daughters out, they saw that they could do so many more things. And then they, when they, saw that if we bring up our boy to be more receptive to this idea, they understood that he could do so many more things emotionally. But even in a household like ours, where there was one brother and three, sisters,
Wow.
where we thought that, Bhaiya was very calm down and very able to communicate and help us in the household. Even in his marriage, because the idea about marriage is again about power in your head. And so as sisters, we had to pay attention to what was going on there and help him understand that, what, you're repeating the same pattern. And he would be shocked because he would be like, I thought I wasn't like this. I didn't mean it like that. And I'm like, it's okay. You be aware, you recognize where is what coming from, and then you step back. You make an aware, conscious choice that I don't want to be that kind of man who pushes down my wife. I want her to flourish, or I want to actively support her. But there are very few men who can do that without resentment.
I mean, I firstly thank you so much for sharing that. I mean, I always say this, and possibly Freebird, the platform, is for this. I share pretty openly. well, whatever it is that I have to share in my life. And I think it's when we talk about these real examples happening with our real family members, and we're okay with discussing it, that other people are like, hey, it's not that taboo anymore. So I appreciate you sharing that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I so hear you, because um, we've all of us, women, men, have gone through different periods where we know that it is right to do something, but maybe because we don't have the emotional bandwidth, ultimately that ends up becoming resentment. And so if that's happening in a relationship or in a marriage without proper resolution, um, it's not going to go very far, and maybe that's one of the reasons why we have so many broken families. And I would even say that in society, with the advent, I remember in the 90s everyone was talking about higher divorce rates and all of that, and even during COVID for that matter. And I feel like that's not even the problem, that exists. The problem is that, why is it that we are not addressing or even able to shift these roles and expectations within relationships? So I don't know,
Yeah,
Rima. One aspect, like you've mentioned, is looking at children and bringing them up the right way, which means that you and I have these conversations and someone listens to it and something goes on in their mind and they understand that they have to be a conscious parent. But what about these poor men who are grown adults right now, right? What is the way forward for them? I mean, what kind of introspection, modalities, forums? I mean, how do we even begin to get them thinking?
so I feel like it has to be a shared process for it to be successful. I mean, you can't really drag people into conversations. What you can do is make whatever space that you're creating hospitable, inclusive, and send out this very clear messaging that you are welcome. For example, when we started Candidly, we did this series of black blog posts about why were there so few men in our workshops. There was one man in our first workshop, and for him to be able to hear so much about assault and especially when women are talking about their trauma, a lot of it becomes anti-men, and I completely get it. I've been through that phase myself, where you tend to generalize and nominalize everything. So he got up and left, and I called him later and asked him, why did you leave? He said, I couldn't bear it. I felt like I was guilty. And I said, but you weren't. But they said that's what I felt like. So we consciously again then made a choice to change our messaging, our tonality, to go keep sending out these things on our platforms, that this is as much about men as it is about women. It's not just a place where you come and bash men. It is a place where you create dialogue and conversation about things that are problematic, the things that are uncomfortable to talk about, and which then brought in so many more perspectives about men sharing how they felt emotionally abused in relationships, how they felt like their desire to go out and do things in the world was met with resentment from their wives and partners because they understood it as actively taking away time from the family. And why does that happen? Because again, women are not conditioned to own something or to even want to try something for themselves, because again, that is not supported by the ecology around them.
Yeah.
So it's like so layered, and there's so many different pieces to it, that at one level there's an individual, and then at a larger level there's the ecosystem that surrounds that individual, and how supportive is that ecosystem. So if it's a woman and her ecosystem does not support her owning or living her own dream, of course she's going to be resentful of her male partner doing that.
Absolutely.
And then for a man, there's that ecosystem that I can't, for example, if there's somebody who likes to bike, wants to go off on biking, wherever he wants to go off, and if he doesn't have a partner who understands that urge, who doesn't take it personally, like you're running away from me, there is going to be that resentment. So for two people to be able to live resourcefully, it is important that both of them have the space to live and own their dreams. And how often does that happen? How often does our ecosystem support that, enable that? Because again, there are more expectations from one partner and less from the other. And now when I look at sort of modern upper middle class families, I'm going to get so many duties for this. Oh my God! But in like a city like Agra, I see most women not doing much in terms of their life, or even when they have the education and they have the wherewithal and they have the money, you see their men walking and running businesses and everything, but the women are just more focused on living a life that is about how do I look like, what am I wearing, which parties am I going to, and I'm like, you're intelligent and you can do so much more, and you're outsourcing even your children's education to tuition teachers. So what are you really doing? What's your focus? And then these women come and say, I feel depressed and anxious and I don't know what to do. Even when I have XYZ, it's because you have nothing of your own.
Yeah. I
So
mean,
you see, and yeah,
eternal man and womankind, mankind. It's human beings' eternal quest to have a life of meaning and purpose. So I completely hear you.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I think without even saying it's men to blame or women to blame, if we are not living a life of purpose and communication mostly of that which sets our soul on fire, then we're already like laying the ground for
everything to break.
yeah, yeah,
Everything to break down, like everything to break down. And I've seen that happening in my own in my own family. And sometimes women actively sabotage themselves, believing these structures we've been made to believe that the house is more important, the families are more important. Like my mom, all through our growing up years, was a very active gynecologist. We hardly saw her. We resented it at that time that she was hardly present, but it made us respect her so much more that she was active and she was an honor, and then that enabled that kind of confidence in us to go out and want to do things, and also to be very, very independent. Like, we grew up independent. We didn't need our mom for like 9% of the stuff we were doing.
yeah,
But when she stopped working, when she fell ill and she stopped working, my dad wanted her to not stop working. He would actively poke her that, what, you need to keep working, you're a surgeon, you need to keep working, you're a surgeon, and you can't just, lay your skills down like that. But the messaging around her from
yeah,
her sisters and her family was, "Baat ho gaya? You spent all your life doing this, blah, blah, blah. You haven't looked after your children, you haven't looked after your husband, your house is run by maids, and all of that. You need to apne shohar ka khayal karo, apne bachcho ka khayal karo." But by doing that, she lost a huge part of herself, where she is now unhappy doing even this. So it's really sad how women also do that to themselves, because this was not a family that was anti any kind of idea. And even today, my dad goes back and says, "I wish your mother hadn't stopped working," because at that point, her life just disintegrated, and now she has no sense of purpose or wanting to do anything more. And at 70s, how do you change someone? You can't. So you just accept it and live with it. But it is sad, and I see that happening in so many places. I mean, that happened with me when I got married. I was hardly 21, and I believed in that whole story of giving up everything for love, and just trying and trying and trying for love, and even if it was love was a brick wall you were breaking your head against, but you kept trying and you kept trying until you broke all of yourself and you came to your senses that this is not. And then you step back and then you rebuild yourself all over again, because that had clearly not worked. So, and where does the story come from? Again, culture, media, all of these, ideas about love being the thing that you sacrifice everything for. Love is something that you build yourself up for, not sacrifice everything for. Yeah. So it's interesting how there are so many strands to this and so many areas to explore. And I feel like so much can be achieved if we just create non-judgmental spaces where there is not this idea of, the feminazi and the anti-man, or the men always do this and men always do that, because no, they don't always do this or do that. When you see successful, enterprising women, you will see a whole host of men around them.
absolutely, absolutely.
And who are those men then?
Yeah, absolutely. I so agree with what you're saying. And it was another really close guy friend of mine who had pointed this out to me, that Sneh, you're not that you can't be courageous yourself, but the fact that you don't think twice, or maybe you are able to kind of put your voice out there, is also because you have a man standing by you who's saying, go be who you have to be. So there are those men as well. Reema, if we had to kind of give away something for the men who are tuning into this Freebird episode, maybe 2 or 3 really easy tools, maybe something that they could start thinking about.
Yeah.
I don't know, because I
Yeah.
would
So
love for them to walk away with something. Would that? Can you
yeah,
help?
so would I. So would I. So would I. I would really, really, love for them to, take away something of value from this. So the first thing I say is, if there's any residual trauma in the relationships that you want to create, or even if it's just about being who you are, take care of that. Go see somebody who's good at this sort of work, so that you are at least able to breathe free. Because the number of men that I talk to, and the one feeling that because a lot of my work has to do with the body and not just the mind, so they describe things like, I feel tightened, like a coil is tight inside me. And if you unpeel it, and then you unpeel it, and you see men breaking down and crying, and that is okay too. So allow yourself, give yourself permission to go to a place of emotional vulnerability and seek healing, actively seek healing. Because for you to be able to be happy and to be, to embrace everything that is in you, that healing needs to happen. That's one. The second thing is, try and be open with communication in every relationship that you're in. That, okay, I don't understand what this means. Can you tell me how you're feeling, or where does this come from? Anger, or this? I've seen men labeling women a lot that they're always this, they're always that. Pucho to sahi, what's going on? Ask that question instead of just joking about it, because you've been trained to joke about it always. You've been trained to put down women by joking about it. Stop doing that and sit down and ask your wives, your girlfriends, your mothers, your sisters, what is going on? How can I help? How can I do this? So what that does is, again, it builds a better connection, and that is better for everybody around. And the same goes for men who are working with females, who are working with women, that, okay, if you see this kind of if you see a difference in approach to a man, understand that it's a difference of the ability and perspective, and not necessarily, anything that has to do with being feminine or masculine. And if you have a problem around it, then there is something you have to pay attention to. Where is this coming from? Is this coming from a place of feeling threatened? Is it coming from a place of feeling less like a man? If that's the case, then I really need to do something. I really need to work on myself. And third, actively seek out platforms that talk about these things. Read on blogs that talk about these things. And one that I can easily suggest is, like, a call to men. It's a blog and a platform by Tony Porter in America, and the way he dismantles what he calls is the man box. So he's done a great video on what is the man box. And the man box is made up of aggression, of violence, of abuse, and he goes to the depth of where it comes from and what it does to women and children. Because that kind of violence and aggression and all of it is projected on those who are weaker than you, and that around you are women and children. So in order to step out of that man box, it takes a lot of honesty, a lot of courage. So that these are communities like that, like a call to men. And there are also communities in India like that, who are doing amazing work, like the Equal Community Foundation, where they go out in communities and villages and busties, and they teach men and boys to be more equitable. Girls, where girls tell boys that, we don't like it when you stare and when you make jokes. Why do you do it? And when you ask them why, they're like, it's because everybody does it. So if you're in any pattern of any sort, pay attention to that pattern and at least ask yourself, why am I doing what I'm doing? And what is the that I'm getting out of it? And if there is, especially for boys, things that they take on as a regular diet, like video games and pornography and stuff, pay attention to what messaging you're receiving from that. That women are objects that have to be devoured or taken control of, or that the pleasure is yours to give, or the pain is yours to give. And what does that do to you? Because again, if you're used to that kind of powerful role in the bedroom, are you then receptive in the bedroom to pleasure? Are you then, gentle enough, or willing enough, or brave enough to let go of a sense of power and to experience that intimacy at every level? Because I don't see that happening a lot. because men, they tend to go into this dominating role where there's something I mean, they forget what it is to be gentle and loving and all of it. And also how it works very interestingly, where you see these very, very macho men who then want to be dominated in the bedroom. And where does that come from? Because there's an aspect of yourself that you're missing out in real life, which is the balance of domination and submission. It's balance. It is a state which is outside of these two categories, where you don't feel shame in either being the upper or the lower, to use that kind of language, where you feel no shame in giving and receiving, where you feel no shame in asking for things or saying that this doesn't work for me. And therefore, you are more balanced everywhere, in your sexuality, in your relationships, in your work. So I feel like, these are the three things that everybody can do, irrespective of whether they're women. Seek out platforms which talk about these things openly with vulnerability, and read about people who've been able to break those stereotypes and live more fully. And I see a lot of that happening now, and it makes me very hopeful.
Yeah.
And for folks who dads and moms, pay attention to the kind of messaging that you're giving to your kids, and the kind of media or toys or stuff you're surrounding them with, because that is also something that they're being that they're absorbing at every level. And how you are in front of them as men and women, as a husband, wife, as parents, is also what they're absorbing. They're watching you all the time.
Oh yes.
And if you put each other down in front of them, if they see a dad putting a mom down, or if they see a mom nagging a dad, those are the patterns that they're going to absorb. That moms nag and wives nag, and husbands, they put down wives, or are vicious or whatever, or controlling. And women are controlling in other ways. They can be very abusive emotionally because they don't get space physically, so they use emotional manipulation. And that is also a fact. That is also something that women need to recognize, that how and when and why do you give into these patterns, and if that is doing you any good, if you're happy, if that makes you happy, that makes you fulfilled. I don't think it does. So, yeah.
Wow, Reema, I mean, I love the fluidity with which you express such big ideas. I
Thank you so much.
More than anything, I think it gives me courage to know that, in the work that you are doing so actively in India, that, well, my Indian brothers and sisters are in good hands. So I take a lot of.
I would certainly like more clients, is what I'd say. Yeah.
No, but also more importantly, I think that these conversations take a heck lot of courage. I am very well aware of the stereotypes and the bullying and the trolling.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I'm quite aware of what it takes to be you and to do the work you do. So I applaud you very much. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
All the men and women who've watched or listened to the podcast today, I really do hope that we can stop looking at our lives as very demarcated. Men are from Mars and women are from Venus, and we can have more authentic conversations about who we are as human beings, and hopefully that takes a small step towards living a more enriched life. Because time's short, but guess what? We've got the right advice, and the right conversation can happen. So thank you so much, Reema.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me here, Sneh. I'm so kicked about this. This is, I'm so just really so kicked that there was a space where I could say all of these things, and I hope they're received well, and even if they're not, well, I would so. All right.
Even if no one's listening, we're going to talk about it.
I'm just going to do my thing.
So, wish you all the best for this week. Loved it.
Thank you so much, Sneha, and a big kudos to you for doing what you're doing and creating the space for people who don't fit in anywhere easily to feel welcomed and to feel like, this is a very safe space for me to say what I want to say. And I'm sure you've done that. And I've seen the kind of work that you've done, and I really, really, really.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
college and all of that. But yeah, really grateful that this happened.